The social theorist and political philosopher Thomas Sowell once wrote that reality is too complex to be comprehended by any human mind. Thus, every individual and every society must construct what Dr. Sowell called a vision. Visions, he said, are like maps that help guide us through a tangle of bewildering complexities. On July 4th, we're reminded of one of man's greatest visions, a map that helped guide a mismatched band of 13 colonies to become the freest, most powerful society on the planet Earth today. That map is the Constitution of the United States of America, ratified in 1787 by the Constitutional Congress in Philadelphia. Now, we would expect any good map to show us the way forward, even when it's not completely clear, to deliver us safely to our destination. Has the Constitution done this? That depends on the destination that our founding fathers had in mind. The preamble to the Constitution states that its goal is to secure the blessings of liberty to the current generation and posterity. Did it succeed in this venture? One way to answer that question would be to compare the world that the founding fathers inherited to the world that they passed on. At the time of the Constitution's writing, most everyone on Earth lived beneath the shadow of one despot or another. So it had been from the beginning of civilization in the Fertile Crescent up until the moment that a patriot at Concord Bridge fired the shot heard round the world. A mere 2 centuries after the Constitution's ratification, the United States of America was the leader of a free world that included over 100 democratic nations. In this still growing global community, billions of people are free to choose their own leaders, to express their opinions, to peaceably assemble, and to practice their faith. For the first time in thousands of years, the right of human beings to do these things is recognized as inherent and universal. In 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson vowed to make the world safe for democracy, constitutional republics were the exception. Today, they are the norm. And when the nations of the world were charting their course towards democracy, they would look to the map of a country that had been there before. Thus, in 1945, the defeated Japanese Empire would begin its new Republican Constitution with 3 words that every American should find familiar: we the people. And they weren't alone. On the Constitution's bicentennial, Time magazine wrote that of the 170 countries existing at the time, more than 160 had written charters based on the U.S. version. Today, that number is higher still. So why is our map the one that so many other countries have chosen to follow? After all, like any map, it's incomplete. It can't provide us with an exact answer to every dilemma, and by the same token, no map can provide us with every detail of the terrain in question. If it did, it wouldn't be a map, but rather a life-size replica. The Constitution is like a map in the sense that it owes its usefulness to its simplicity. The fact that it leaves things out isn't a weakness, it's a strength. What the Constitution gives us, instead of an answer to every problem we may face, is a direction. We know how important it is to stay on that course because we've seen what happens when our leaders try to abandon it. A citizenry that doesn't know what the Constitution says won't be able to hold the government accountable when they violate it. And as history shows, we do have leaders who are willing to violate the Constitution. But as Patrick Henry put it, the Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government, lest it come to dominate our lives and interests. We ignore the Constitution at our own peril, because it performs one of the most vital duties of a map. It helps us steer clear of the dangers that lie along our path. And chief among these dangers is that of a government grown too large, too entrenched, or too powerful. The Founding Fathers pledged their sacred honor to fighting tyranny, and so with the Constitution, they designed a government that would be truly of, by, and for the people. Their success owes to 3 great political innovations: the inclusion of a Bill of Rights, the designation of checks and balances, and provisions for the peaceful transfer of power from one ruler to the next. In the absence of these institutions, great societies have crumbled. They've descended into oppression, misery, and violence. but because our Constitution honors these principles, we have endured. Our endurance owes in great part to the Bill of Rights, the Constitution's most famous component. Some are surprised to learn that the Bill of Rights was not originally included in the Constitution, but that shouldn't indicate that the Founding Fathers didn't think the freedoms it listed were important. To the contrary, the main reason why there wasn't originally a Bill of Rights was because so many Founding Fathers thought it was superfluous. Thomas Jefferson commented that the institutional limits set on government amounted to the innate inclusion of a Bill of Rights. But Jefferson and other members of the Anti-Federalist Party worried that future generations may not interpret the Constitution correctly. And so Congress agreed that a Bill of Rights was a necessary part of the sacred covenant between the government and the governed. This covenant is what the English political philosopher John Locke called the social contract, an agreement in which the people agree to surrender some portion of their liberty so that the bulk of their freedoms can remain intact. As he put it, the only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another. If the people's leaders failed to protect their rights, then the people had a moral obligation to institute a new government. And that's what the founders did when they signed the Declaration of Independence and began the American Revolution. With the Constitution, the Founding Fathers continued that legacy of revolution, and we as Americans carry it on today. Effectively, the Bill of Rights is to the Constitution what the sharp red line of a hostile border is on any other map. It speaks loudly to any would-be tyrant, the way President Reagan spoke to Soviet tyrants 2 centuries later. There is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. In the absence of such clear boundaries, the potential for democracy disappears. The Constitution of the 8th year, adopted by France in 1799, is rarely commented in classrooms, but it was an essential stepping stone in Napoleon's rise to dominance. It secured for him the powers of a dictator, and unlike all its predecessors, it did not contain a Declaration of Rights. Using the wide latitude granted him by this charter, Napoleon was able to organize an entire state around his charisma, and in 1804, he crowned himself emperor. Although Napoleon was not as disastrous for human rights as many dictators have been, he nonetheless exemplified an attitude that 20th century fascists would mimic, namely the attitude that his people only had rights because he allowed them to. A cynic through and through, Napoleon believed that people would eagerly abandon their natural freedoms in exchange for convenience and material comfort. He once famously remarked that a man will fight harder for his interests than his freedoms. This attitude helped solidify the continued reign of kings in France. Even after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, it would be 30 years before the establishment of another French Republic. Unless we want an emperor, we must be vigilant to ensure that our Bill of Rights maintains its status. Contrary to Napoleon's view, the Founding Fathers didn't think that they could give rights to anyone. They believed God had already done that. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are things with which we, the people, were born, and no legitimate government would ever seek to deny them. Yet from the mid-20th century onwards, this perspective has withered into obscurity. Today we have a government that often behaves as if we, the people, only retain our God-given rights when and if they say we do. We're protected from unreasonable search and seizure, except when it comes to our phone calls and emails. We are entitled to a quick and speedy public trial unless we pose an ill-defined threat to national security. We have the freedom to assemble and express our political views unless those views attract the scrutiny of the IRS. In the Constitution, we the people have a nearly perfect map for maintaining our liberty, if we could only get the government to follow it. When our leaders disregard their responsibility to protect our rights, they undermine the very function of their office. The Constitution may be the single greatest document ever written, but some elected representatives will treat it like any other piece of paper if we allow them to. Justice Antonin Scalia once said that every banana republic has a Bill of Rights. He makes a good point. More than a list of lines that they must not cross, all governments need a strong institutional framework that contains inherent limits to what they can do. And herein lies one of the Constitution's greatest strengths, the ingenious system of checks and balances, whereby our government is divided into what John Adams called 3 equiponderant independent branches. These 3 branches are, of course, the legislative, executive, and judicial, and each one is vital to performing the duties of government. Most importantly, each one is capable of checking the others. Without this institution, the founders feared that the federal government may become tyrannical. As James Madison wrote in the Federalist No. 47, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Madison's opinion on this matter had been well informed by centuries of historical experience. Time and again, even long after his death, it's been shown that when one branch of government is allowed to become more powerful than all the others, no law can protect the individual. History offers no graver caution than the corruption of the Weimar Republic after World War II. Although the Weimar Constitution appeared to divide power into separate branches of government, one important loophole effectively allowed the executive branch to rule the country on its own. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution allowed the president to impose martial law without the prior consent of the legislature, known as the Reichstag. If they rejected his use of Article 48, the president could simply dissolve the Reichstag's council and demand new elections. This is exactly what President von Hindenburg did in July of 1930. The emergency election of a new Reichstag is what brought the Nazis into power and ultimately enabled Hitler to become Chancellor of the Weimar Republic. Hitler would use Article 48 to his nefarious advantage following the Reichstag fire. Through the absurd and excessive powers granted to him, he and his Nazi thugs were able to harass, oppress, and ultimately destroy all political opposition to their takeover of the German government. One might react with surprise to learn that the Weimar Constitution included many of the rights that our own Constitution guarantees for us, among them habeas corpus, freedom of speech, press, and assembly. The American journalist and historian William Shirer wrote that, on paper, this Constitution was the most liberal and democratic document of its kind that the 20th century had ever seen. Yet these rights that it guaranteed would be trampled by an out-of-control government that the Constitution's own weaknesses had allowed to come to power. The lesson of Weimar is unmistakable. When one branch of government is allowed to operate with complete freedom, the people are enslaved. And if we are not vigilant about adhering to the Constitution, then this lesson will be taught at home. As is the case with the Bill of Rights, many American leaders, past and present, have chosen to decamp from the Constitution's charted course. In particular, the expanding power of the presidency poses a grave threat to the system of checks and balances. Many Americans are only too happy when a president for whom they voted, who is a member of their party, uses executive authority in a way with which they agree. Yet when their power exceeded its constitutional limits, even very popular presidents would commit some of our history's gravest errors. They would infringe on our constitutionally protected right to firearms. They would go after whistleblowers and imprison journalists. During World War II, one of America's best remembered presidents would imprison over 100,000 innocent Japanese Americans based solely on their race. It's hard to imagine how the authority to suspend our most fundamental law could possibly be used for good, and harder still to find an example of it happening. And yet we have allowed it. The fact that the Constitution the fact that these overreaches of executive authority have not yet resulted in a disaster comparable to Germany's does not mean that they never will. Every president of the Weimar Republic would employ Article 48. Some would employ it hundreds of times, always with the best of intentions. Yet the precedent that these actions set, namely that executive authority could act as a substitute for that of the legislature, This precedent would spell the end of liberty in Germany. Article 48 may have worked to the advantage of the people hundreds of times, yet all that was required for the end of the Republic was for the Constitution to be successfully undermined once. And so it was. Undivided power leads to unaccountable government, and that is the antithesis of the founders' mission. To institute a government that truly answered to the citizens, the founders wanted to make sure that it was always composed of citizens. Individuals who were, in the words of James Madison, called for the most part from pursuits of a private nature and appointed for a short period of office. The Constitution's provision for the peaceful rotations of power has kept our government accountable to us, and therein lies perhaps its greatest strength. Sections 2 and 3 of the Constitution's first article outline the process whereby legislators are elected. Elegant in their simplicity, these short paragraphs have provided for the transition of power bloodlessly from the old hands to the new for more than 200 years. And American people dissatisfied with their leaders can do away with them, as is their right, without having to resort to violence, as our forefathers did. And this system still works today. In 2010, 53 members of the House of Representatives were overthrown by their constituents. Overthrown, without a single window broken, shot fired, or drop of blood spilled. It's important for our legislators to remember that their time in office is not indefinite and that they are not invincible. As George Mason said, nothing is so essential to the preservation of Republican government as a periodical rotation, and nothing so strongly impels a man to regard the interests of his constituents as the certainty of one day returning to the general mass of the people from whence he was taken, where he must participate in their burdens. Our founders wrote a constitution whereby power would change hands, because they had fought so hard to escape the tyranny of leaders who reigned for life. George Washington was offered a crown when the United States triumphed over Britain. He spurned it, saying, "I did not defeat George III to become George I." After 2 terms in office, he stepped down, and nearly every president since has followed suit. A system whereby members of government rotate steadily out of office is the surest way to hold them accountable and to ensure domestic tranquility. Throughout history, from ancient times up to the modern era, mighty countries have fallen because they did not heed this lesson. The Soviet Union went through 3 constitutions, one in 1924, the next in 1936, the last in 1977. Instead of securing the rights of those under Soviet rule, these documents were written to maintain the power of the rulers. Despite paying lip service to the rights of free speech, assembly, and even religion, not one of these constitutions specified clear rules of succession and rotation for Soviet leadership, nor did they place a fixed time limit for when that authority should expire. As a result, power belonged to whoever could seize it, through cunning, coercion, or violence. And once such a person gained power, he could cling to it for life. Inevitably, brutes were the ones who rose to lead this empire, from the terror of Joseph Stalin, whose regime would ultimately murder more than 20 million of his own people, to the terror of Nikita Khrushchev, whose flirting with nuclear war and human extinction, to the military oppression of Leonid Brezhnev, whose infamous doctrine kept the freedom-loving peoples of Eastern Europe in its iron grip for decades. These leaders perpetuated a condition of tyranny and human misery that had never before been seen on earth. The Soviets, so certain that they and they alone understood the progress of history, had failed to learn what our founders understood centuries before: that wherever there is great enough power to be seized, there will be men corrupt enough to seize it. And that's why our Constitution has succeeded, by restraining power. It's done this by listing the rights that our representatives may never take from us, by balancing governmental authority against itself, and by ensuring a steady rotation of leadership. With the government in check, individuals are free to manage their own destinies, and America has prospered through their ingenuity and hard work. But there will always be danger. Danger that our leaders may disregard the Constitution and the legacy of our founders will be undone. The day we stop standing up for the Constitution is the day that we lose the freedoms it guarantees. The greatest tragedies in human history took place when governments were allowed to grow too large and too powerful. As long as we adhere to our Constitution, we know that that will not happen in America. We have a map that has led us and the rest of the world towards peace, security, and freedom. We just have to follow it. Thank you.